Hey there, Pro-Church Media community, this is Jason. In this tutorial, we're going to take a look at how to create this fun neon text effect, complete with blinking text, cabling, some great glow, some rising fog, all kinds of great stuff. This is going to be a bit of a more advanced tutorial with expressions and pre-comping and lots of different effects, but I think you're going to learn a ton and it's going to be a lot of fun, so let's dive right into this. Let's start by creating a new composition, Command N on your keyboard, and I'm just going to call this neon text and make it 1080 by 1920, kind of like an Instagram story size, make it 10 seconds in duration, hit OK. Alright, so the first thing I want to do is create just a background layer, so I'm going to grab my rectangle tool by hitting Q, and then just drag out a rectangle. I already have a color that I want, so I'm just going to copy and paste that. You can use whatever color you want, but something dark and probably on the cooler end of things will work pretty good for this, so hit OK, and then just call this background, and I think we'll be good to go with that. Okay, so now we need to get our text in there, and I'm going to be using a font called HT Neon. This is an Adobe font typeface, so if you go to your character panel and click on the font family selection, you can go to this Add Adobe Fonts button, and that's going to take you to the Adobe Fonts website. And then you can just type in, you could even type in neon if you wanted to, and just go to HT Neon, and then it's going to pull that up, just hit activate if this isn't already active, and it's going to automatically sync it to your system. You don't even have to close After Effects, and you're good to go, so that's pretty sweet. Alright, so let's jump back into After Effects, and just grab my type tool with Command T, and I'm just going to type in Jesus, and just scale it up a bit, maybe zoom in here to see what I'm doing, and I might just make sure it's at 0 kerning, and so maybe something like this, and I think I'll leave it that color for right now, and then I'm just going to duplicate it and do saves, and just kind of lay this out the way I want it. I think something like that will work pretty well. I might pull up the proportional grid just to kind of get this kind of in the center, and I think that looks pretty good, so we'll go with that. Okay, so now we want to pre-comp these, and so I'm just going to make sure they're both selected, and then right-click and say Pre-Compose. I'm just going to call this Jesus text _1, move all attributes into the new composition, hit OK. And now I'm going to double-click to go into that composition. Okay, so you can change the colors manually here if you want to, but we're actually going to be setting up a color control layer in the original comp so we can control these without having to always come back into this composition. And we're going to be using these text layers to drive a lot of other text layers, which is why they're in a pre-comp in the first place. Okay, so let's jump back to our neon text layer, and I'm going to create a new null, Command-Shift-Alt-Y, and I'm just going to call this color control. And we're going to add an expression control to this, so if you go to Effect, and then scroll down to Expression Controls, and then do Color Control. We're going to make 2 of these, and you might just call it Text1, and then duplicate it and call it Text2. And I already have some colors that I want to use, so I'm just going to copy and paste these. So I have this pink color, which I'm going to put in Text2, and then I have this blue color, which I'm going to put in Text1. You can of course use whatever color you want, and the way that we're setting this up, it's going to be super easy to change the colors later on. Okay, so once you have your colors set, and you can always set them later, just go ahead and lock this off right now, because this will keep this persistent. So now we can go into the pre-comp for the text layer, and we want to twirl down to the text. We want to add a fill color and just do RGB, and then you can either alt-click on the stopwatch and then use the pick whip to drag it up to that text color, or alternately, you can just drag this little pick whip right here and just drag it up to the color, and it's going to do pretty much the exact same thing. And you can see it changes that pink, added the expression for you, so you can save yourself a step. We're going to do the same thing for the Jesus text. Go to the Animate button, go to Fill Color, RGB, and then just drag that pick whip up to that color, and we have that color now. So now when we change this color control, like if I change this to yellow, you can see it's going to change it. And so now we can adjust our text color from out in this main composition, which will make it super easy. So I'm just going to undo that to go back to the blue, and we have our color control set up just like that. Okay, so now we're going to start making this look a little more neonish. I mean, I did choose this font because it looks kind of like a neon sign, but we definitely need some glows and things like that, so let's start setting that up. So with our pre-comp selected, let's duplicate this. I'm going to call this glow. Maybe just call it glow1, _1. And the reason I'm using underscores with a number is that every time you duplicate it, it's going to sequentially add a number to it, as you can see. And so that can help save a little bit of a step. Okay, so let's unlock this color control, and we need to add a Gaussian blur to this. So go to Effect, Blur and Sharpen, Gaussian Blur. And for this one, we're going to do something pretty low, maybe something like 28 or so. And you can see we're starting to get that nice glow already. And let's go ahead and set this to add. And so now it's kind of making it a little more hot in the middle, even though it's looking all that way, but we're going to fix that here. And then we're going to add a layer style to this. So if you right click and go to Layer Styles and then choose Inner Glow. All right, and then just twirl this down, and we want to change this to, let's do the opacity like 78 or so. You can see it's kind of making it a little brighter here. And we want to, instead of having the source from the edge, we want it to be center. And for size, let's do something like 9. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. Now let's duplicate this, and you can see it's making it a little brighter. Let's change this to lighten. And I think we'll go with that. And then for the blurriness, let's just really crank this up to like 250 or so. And so now we're getting, that kind of nice diffuse glow in the back. That's still a little bit colored, so you can see we're catching the colors from these text layers. And so that looks pretty nice. Okay, so let's work on some behind the text glows. So let's duplicate this glow, and we'll put it behind the Jesus text. And let's really crank the blurriness up even more. So let's take it up to like 670. And so now we're getting even more diffuse glow here. And let's duplicate this again. Or let's actually call this back glow _1. Let's duplicate it just to kind of make the effect a bit more. And there we go. I think that'll work pretty well. Okay, so this is looking a little bit more like neon text, but it's still, there's not any real variation in the text itself. And so let's work on this actual text layer here. So first of all, let's add an inner glow to this. And so right click, go to Layer Styles, Inner Glow. And let's, I guess, kind of do the exact same thing that we did before. Let's maybe bump it up just a bit to like 78. And for the size, let's put it to 9. And then let's do center. And so now you can see we're starting to get that nice really hot highlight in the middle, and it's kind of tapering off to the edge, and so it looks a lot more like a neon sign now, and there's a lot more visual interest here. Right now it looks pretty good, but the text is maybe just a little bit too perfect, and a lot of times neon signs have a little bit of imperfections in the tubing, and so we're going to add an effect called Caustics. And so if you go to Effect, then go down to Simulation, and then Caustics, this is going to help us kind of distort the text layer just a bit. So for the bottom here, we want to just put this to none, and then leave that the way it is. You can twirl that up. For the water surface, we want to change this to the text layer, and you can see we're starting to get almost a kind of liquidy look. And for the wave height, let's change that. Let's change that to about like 0.03, just so it's nice and tight on the text. For the smoothing, let's really crank it up to something maybe like 45. For the depth, let's maybe drop it down to like half, like 0.6 or something like that, 0.7. And I don't know if you can tell, we're starting to get just a little bit of like almost crimping on those parts right there. If you turn it off, you can see it's kind of, crimping them just a bit. And let's see what else. For the surface opacity, let's drop it down to like 0.15 or so. And for the caustic strength, let's crank it up to about 5. And if you start, turning it on and off, you can kind of see mostly where these little parts are right here that it's almost crimping them just a little bit. And so it's deforming it just a bit and giving us just a little bit of a different look. Let's put the lighting, twirl the lighting down, and let's change this to point source. And so that'll get rid of most of the background light. And then for the light intensity, let's put it down to 0. And then for the light height, let's maybe pull it up to like 3.2 or something like that. And then leave the ambient light where it is. And I think that'll work pretty well. I mean, it's pretty subtle, but it's, you know, almost constraining that glow a little bit. But it's also pushing out the light a little bit more. And so, I mean, if you like it, you can use it. If you don't, you don't have to. I think it, you know, gives a little bit more visual interest. Like right here, you can see it's not as smooth as it used to be. It's almost, you know, these imperfections, I think, make it look a little bit more like a neon sign, but I think that'll be good for this. All right, so we're looking pretty good here, but we can push this even further. We're gonna add, if we go back to this previous one, you can see in here we have these little kind of clips or something like that that are kind of supposed to look like they're holding the sign onto the wall or whatever. And so let's work on those. So we're gonna create let's just grab our rectangle tool, and maybe for the fill, let's do kind of like a mid-gray of sorts. And then we want just kind of a, you know, smallish rectangle, probably something like that. Okay, so now we need to, let's put this down below the glows, so now all the glows will be affecting this. And now we need to add some layer styles to this to make it look a little bit better. So let's first of all add a drop shadow, go to Layer Styles, Drop Shadow, and then twirl it down. Let's pull the opacity up to 100. Let's put the blend mode at normal, because we're actually going to be using this drop shadow to help make it look like it has some depth. Let's go down to the distance, and let's maybe do something like 4. Let's crank the spread up to 100, and so now you can see we're almost getting, you know, kind of some depth with this. For the size, let's put that down to 1. And I think that should be pretty good for the drop shadow. Now let's add an inner shadow. So if you right click, go to Layer Styles, and then do Inner Shadow. Let's go down to that, twirl it down. Multiply is fine. We'll put the inner shadow opacity down to like 54. For the distance, let's leave it at 5. And then for the size, we'll leave it at 5. I think that actually looks pretty good. And then the last thing we want to add is a satin layer style. So once again, right click over here, go to Layer Styles, Satin, and then you can go down to your layer styles, twirl that down. Let's put the blending mode on normal, maybe bump up the opacity maybe to like 61 or something like that. Leave the angle where it is, the distance and the size is fine. And so now we have this almost clip looking thing, and let's just call this clips. And these are just going to go behind the text. And so what we want to do is just grab this layer, and actually just want to grab the rectangle itself, and then just pull it over here. You can use W to pull up your rotation tool, and then just try to make it, you know, perpendicular to the text at different places. And so then with that selected, I'm just going to duplicate and move it around to different places. Like I might put it here and just rotate it around. We now have these clips, they're looking pretty good, and I think we're good to go with that. All right, so in our previous example, we had these cables, and so we're gonna add these cables in too, basically doing the exact same thing. So I'm gonna grab the pen tool. You can also use the keyboard shortcut G to grab that. And then I'm gonna take off the fill, and then do a stroke. I'm just gonna do it black. Maybe like 3 or so will work pretty well. And then I'm just gonna kind of start drawing I guess a cable or I don't know what this actually is with the neon sign, but I'm just gonna call it a cable. And so something like that, put it down below, maybe put it above the clips. And then I'm going to keep drawing little cable ties between where the text doesn't connect. Just have it kind of pull off the end of that. If you get poor performance out of After Effects, because this is pretty render intensive stuff, you can always bump your resolution down and also make sure it's not on 16-bit. You will want it to be on 16-bit eventually, but if you put it on 8-bit, you should get a little bit better performance. So let's add some layer styles to make this look a little bit better. First of all, I'm going to call this cables. Okay, so right click, go to layer styles, and we're going to start with a drop shadow. Let's change the blend mode to normal. Let's do an opacity of, say, 30%. And then angle could probably be something like, let's do 168. Distance, maybe we'll do like 20. And then we'll do a spread of 100 and a size of 1. All right, so now we have a pretty subtle drop shadow. It's adding just a little bit of depth to our cables. It's pretty subtle, but it looks pretty good, gives it a little bit of depth. Okay, so now let's add another effect. Go to Layer Styles, Bevel, and Emboss. And for this one, let's change the style to Emboss. And I very rarely use Bevel and Emboss, but this is a situation where it actually works pretty well. Let's leave the technique at smooth, depth at 100%. Let's change the direction to down. I think that'll be pretty good. Let's change the size to maybe 4. Let's change the highlight color opacity to something like 23. We want it to be pretty subtle like that. We can leave the multiply one where it's at. Okay, so now we have our cables, we have our clips, and so our neon sign is really coming together. Okay, so we're going to keep pushing this forward just a little bit, and we're going to set this up so that when we do our text blink, we're still going to have like the non-lit up neon tubes behind this. And so we're going to create another text precomp. And so up in your project panel, go to the Jesus text _1, duplicate that, go ahead and open that up. And what we want to do is we want to lock this composition off, and then we want to open up another composition window. So if you click on the Jesus text 2, you can go to New Comp Viewer. It's going to add a new comp viewer. Just choose the one that you want. Let's leave Jesus text 2 over here, and let's change this one to Jesus text 1. And let's drag the Jesus text 2 timeline right here. And so basically the reason we're doing this is just so we can connect these source text to these ones, so every time we change these ones change as well. Okay, so you can just make sure that the source text is open for both of these in Jesus text 1, and then in the Jesus text 2 timeline, you can just grab this little pick whip and then just drag it to that source text, and then you can do the same thing with the Jesus text. Just drag it down there, and so now if I change this to, say, God, you can see it changes it over here too, so that works out pretty well, and this should be set up and we're ready to go. So we can now close that off, we can close that off, and we can go back here and we want to unlock that. Okay, so let's go back to our neon text composition, and let's duplicate this, and this one we can replace with this Jesus text 2. So if you hold alternate and click and drag and then just release it, it's going to replace that. And initially nothing's going to happen because they're the exact same thing. But we do want to take off the caustics, and we're going to change the blending mode to overlay. Let's go ahead and turn off Jesus text 1 just so we can see what we're doing. Maybe get rid of the glows as well, just so we can kind of see what's happening. Okay, so we want to add, we should have a drop shadow on here already, or actually let's add a drop shadow. So right click, go to Layer Styles, Drop Shadow. And then for this, let's change the opacity. Let's do the exact same thing that we did for the cables, and like so we'll do 30%, 168. We could just copy and paste it, but we're already here. Let's do distance of 28, size of 2, and then I think that should be pretty good. All right, so we also want to have, let's get rid of the inner glow. We want to do a bevel and emboss, so let's right click, go to Layer Styles, Bevel and Emboss. Let's twirl this down. We want it to be inner bevel. We'll do smooth, we'll do a distance, a direction. Let's change the size to about 3, have it going up. Let's maybe change the angle to like 322, and we'll let's do the altitude like 33. Leave this at screen. Let's drop the opacity of this just a bit, and maybe for this, let's make it a little bit more on the dark gray rather than black side of things. And then lastly, we want to add a fill effect to this. So go to Effect, Color Correction, or actually Generate Fill. And let's change this to kind of like a light-ish gray or something like that. And then let's take this overlay off just so we can see what this looks like. So you can see we have more of a kind of tube look going on here. We're also going to add an effect called Matte Choker. So go to Effect, Matte Choker. This is just going to restrict how thick this is, just so our shadow is not so big. And so let's change the geometric softness to something like 6.6 or so, and you can see it's kind of choking it in just a bit. Okay, we can change this back to overlay. We can re-enable the rest of these layers. And so now you can see we're getting our shadow off of this tube, and I think restricting the size of it makes it look more like it's actually catching the shadow of the tube rather than as big as the glow layer itself. Okay, so we're looking pretty good, and now back in this one, what we had here was some blinking effects on the text, and so we're going to work on that right now. So let's go back into the Jesus Text 1 pre-composition, and then we want to duplicate these two layers. Well, let's start with Jesus, and so this is we're going to use this as our original, and so let's just duplicate it, and you can actually disable this one. And we want to create a mask on this, so if you pull up the pen tool with G and then just draw a mask around this J here. And so now just the J will show up, and then we'll duplicate this again, and then let's just set this to subtract so that now we have the ESUS as the other layer. We're going to do the same thing with saves. Let's just pull this down here so we can think of that as our original. Let's duplicate it. We can pull it back, this one back up. And let's make the S one of the layers, and so just kind of mask around that layer. And then we'll duplicate this, and you can pull up the mask again. Let's actually just get rid of the mask because I just want to do the A and the V here. So just gonna split that middle right there. Do that. Duplicate it one more time. Get rid of the mask. Do the same thing except the E and the S. And now we should have all of our text layers. Alright, so now let's get the blinking going on with our text here. So we want to go back to our neon text composition, add a new control layer, so Command-Alt-Shift-Y to add a new null. Let's call this blink. And we want to add an expression control to it, so go to Effect, Expression Controls, and then Slider Control. Let's call this blink_1. We want to duplicate it a few times. Let's actually, before we do that, let's set this value to 100. Now we can duplicate it, one for each one of our text pieces there. And now we need to add an expression to this for our blink. I have one right here. I'll put this in the comments of the video so you don't have to try to type this all out. And then just Alt-click on this stopwatch, paste it in here. And so what's happening with this is it's just defining a few variables. So this on equals 100, off equals 0. And then this x variable is basically saying this x is this wiggle effect, so it's basically randomizing the value based on a certain rate and a certain amount. And so basically it's saying if this number that this spits out is greater than 50, set the value to 100, and if it's less than it, set it to 0. And so when this is set to opacity, it's basically saying if the value is greater than 50, make it full on opaque. If it's less than 50, make it fully transparent or 0% opacity. And so we have that there. We might change this to like, maybe like 12 and 60. And then let's lock this off, go to our Jesus text. Then we need to pull up the opacity, so hit T for opacity, and then just grab your little pick whip, go up to that slider, and now it should start blinking. Sometimes there you can see it's starting to blink, and it's definitely just randomizing it, which is great. Okay, so now we need to do the same thing for all of these. So let's pull up the opacity with T, and then just start dragging these to the other sliders, and we're gonna put the expression on those here in a second. 4 and 5. Okay, let's go back here, and then let's just copy this by right-clicking here, go to copy expression, and then just select all of these, Command V to paste, and it should paste that there. And then let's just solo this Jesus text layer and see if we have our blink going on, and we do. And so that's looking pretty good. Okay, so let's add a few more glows to make this look a little better, then we'll add our fog and be done with this. So let's unsolo this, duplicate this glow 2, get rid of the Gaussian blur, and then let's go up to Effect, and then go down to Blur and Sharpen, and then Directional Blur. Let's set the direction to like 40, put the blur length to like 215, and you can see we're starting to get that nice kind of blur effect going. Let's duplicate this, just so we can get even more blur. And then we need to add a sharpen effect, so let's go up to Effect, and then Blur and Sharpen, and maybe do like 775 or so, just to get those nice sharp edges on those glows. And so let's then duplicate this one more time, just to really intensify that effect. I think that's looking really nice. Okay, to finish this off, let's add our fog. So just to make this go a little faster, let's just solo this Jesus text one. Actually, we can, let's just solo the background. Let's add a new solid, Command Y. Let's call this fog. Let's make this black. Hit OK. And hit OK. And then we need to go to Effect, Noise and Grain, and then Fractal Noise. And then let's change the fractal type to Dynamic Progressive. Let's maybe bump up the contrast a bit, bring the brightness down a little bit. Go to Transform, scale it up a little bit. For the sub settings, let's just make the rotation like something like 120, just so we have that kind of smoky, foggy feel. And then let's add an evolution keyframe right here, and also add an offset turbulence keyframe. Let's go forward to 2 seconds, do Control 8 to add a marker. We're going to make this loop, so then we pull this back to right there, take this all the way to the end. Now we go to the very last keyframe, and let's just have the evolution go like 2 revolutions, and we'll just have the turbulence offset up a little bit. And let's see if that looks, see what that looks like. We want it to be pretty subtle. Something like that will probably work pretty well. Okay, so let's change the opacity to something maybe like 30, and let's go to about 8 seconds or so. Add an opacity keyframe, and then let's go to about 812, and then have it go all the way down to 0. And then let's duplicate this, bring it over here, make sure this marker just goes 1 past the end, and then we want the let's have the opacity keyframed right there. Let's actually get rid of all the keyframes and add a keyframe right there. Come right here, take it down to 0, and now this should fade in like so. Now let's move our fog right below the right above this text 2, I think. Let's see if we did that. Let's put it right above the text 1. Let's set this to soft light. We can unsolo these so that everything's out there. And let's just mask this off real quick. So grab your pen tool. You can also hit G to pull that up. We're just going to draw a mask kind of here in the center. Make it kind of an amorphous blob, something like that. And then double M to pull up the mask properties. Let's just crank up the mask feather. I might just solo this just so I can see what's going on. Maybe expand it a bit. Pull in that feather pretty high. We want it to just be a really subtle effect, maybe not so much expansion. Then I'm just going to copy this mask, paste it over here, then we can make sure we got the right mask there. Must have gotten the wrong mask. Let me just copy that again. We'll paste it there. There we go. Alright, so now we can unsolo that. And now we should have some pretty subtle fog here in the middle. And if you put this on 16-bit, you're going to see the best version of this. And it's going to be pretty render intensive, but you can see we have that nice fog in the middle. And we have our cabling, we have our little clips behind, we have the text blinking on and off. You can see even when it blinks, we have like the empty tubes behind, and the lighting is affecting the cables and everything else. And so it's just a pretty sweet look. And what's cool about this is since we set up this color control, like say I wanted to change this to like an orange or a yellow, I can just quickly change that to an orange. Everything is linked up to it. I have that happening. I can change this. Maybe I want it to be like a purple or something. So it's pretty easy to make color corrections. And of course, if you want to change up the text, you just go into the Jesus text, change these source layers right here. You probably have to remask things, move the clips and the cabling around, but it's pretty easy to create some fun neon text effects in After Effects. So that's basically it. I know this is a longer tutorial, but I hope you got just some great ideas from this, and you can see there's tons of fun things you can do with text inside of After Effects, and they're not terribly difficult to do once you kind of get your head around what's going on. So get into After Effects, make some awesome neon text projects, and I will talk to you later.